The snow whipped across the street that Christmas Eve, and I found my grandson shivering barefoot on the porch, clutching a broken toy. From inside came laughter, music, and clinking glasses, his parents celebrating without him. I pushed the door open, warmth flooding out, and 7 words froze every smile in house. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The snow whipped across the street that Christmas Eve, and I found my grandson shivering barefoot on the porch, clutching a broken toy. His small hands trembled, his lips were the color of bruised plums, and his eyes were glassy, too young to understand why the door locked behind him. Inside, laughter rattled the windows. Music, clinking glasses, warmth I used to know. I lifted the boy. His toes were stiff as chalk. The broken toy, some plastic knight with a missing arm, pressed into my coat as he tried to hide it, as if the damage were his fault. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered. "Grandpa's here." I pushed the door open. Heat rolled over us in a wave thick with cinnamon and champagne. A dozen faces turned. My son stood near the tree. Handsome suit. Shiny watch. The posture of a man who believes he will never see consequences. His wife grazed his elbow, smiling with all teeth and no soul. Their friends were mid-toast when I spoke the only words that mattered. "I don't cry." I came back with a lawyer. Silence, clean and surgical, cut through the music. Someone set a glass down too hard. A string of lights popped. My grandson tucked his face into my shoulder and breathed like a cornered bird. I used to think Christmas smelled like pine and pipe smoke, and my late wife's gingerbread. Tonight it smelled like money burned for fun. I looked at David. My boy, my only boy. I had carried him under burning roofs and across colder winters than this. I had paid his tuition, his rent, his first car insurance. I had written checks with trembling hands and called it love. I had believed love was supposed to hurt if it was real. "Dad, you can't just walk in here," he said, every word polished like a showroom floor. "We're having friends over." "Your son was on the porch," I said, barefoot. He blinked. A flash of annoyance, like a man being asked to sign for a package that wasn't his. He was loud. We asked him to calm down. His wife chimed in, soft voice, hard edges. "He needs boundaries." Boundaries. That word again. They used it like a fence meant to keep me out while keeping their conscience clean. I stepped farther in. Every stare felt like a draft. On the mantel, there was a photo of David standing beside a luxury car. I had helped him finance. He told everyone he earned it himself. Another photo showed the housewarming I paid for. The deed I held years ago pulsed like a heartbeat in my memory. I caught my reflection in the window, older than I remember. Shoulders bent from a lifetime of carrying other people's fires. Widower, retired firefighter. Father who believed debt could be love if you stamped it hard enough with sacrifice. "You left him in the cold," I said, each word laid down like a brick. "That ends tonight." Sieb Tings, a friend of theirs, face already flushed with drink, laughed. "Come on, old man. It's a party." I met his eyes and didn't blink. He looked away first. It was a small, clean victory, and it landed without a sound. David's smile thinned. "If you wanted to see him, you should have called. You can't just—" "I did call," I said. 12 times. Maybe more. The ringing kept me company. Nobody spoke. The whole room listened to the smallest sounds, my grandson's breath, the hum of the heater, the quiet count of a man deciding where to set the next match. I set the broken knight on the coffee table. Its head rolled and stopped, looking up at the chandelier like it had an answer. "He can keep the toy," I said. "The rest, we'll discuss in daylight." David took a step closer, lowering his voice the way men do when they want to sound reasonable while they prepare to be cruel. "Don't make a scene. You're embarrassing yourself." I almost laughed. I had eaten embarrassment for dinner for years. I had washed it down with promises and called it hope. I kissed my grandson's temple. He smelled like winter air and sugar. "We're going home," I told him. "My home." David scoffed, but there was a tiny tremor where his jaw met his ear, one soft place left. He didn't know yet what I knew. He didn't know the paper I kept in a fireproof box. He didn't know what boundaries look like when they are written in law. The room seemed smaller. The party had nowhere to go but quiet. Behind me, snow hissed against the porch light. Ahead of me, a path I should have taken years ago unfurled like clean ice. I turned to the door, holding the boy closer. "Sleep," I whispered. "I'll handle the rest." And for the first time that night, maybe the first time in years, I felt warm, then wait for me to type before proceeding. When I carried my grandson back into the night, his head resting on my shoulder, the memories came like smoke from an old fire, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. I remembered the years before wealth hardened David's heart, before pride dressed him in suits too tight for his soul. I was 24 when I first carried him, newborn and wailing, into the tiny house where my wife had decorated a nursery with more love than money. She was gone now, 5 winters buried, and all that remained was me, the firefighter who fought blazes by day and fathered alone by night. I rocked David to sleep with soot still on my hands, whispered stories while the city outside burned with sirens. I promised him he would never face the cold alone. Through scraped knees, broken bikes, and late-night fevers, I was there. I worked double shifts at the firehouse, sweat freezing inside my jacket, then came home to cook macaroni and listen to his dreams. When he cried over algebra, I sat at the table and puzzled it out with him, even when my eyelids wanted to collapse. I sold my old pickup to pay for his baseball camp. I skipped meals so he could have seconds. I gave, and still they wanted more. Back then, David looked at me like I hung the moon. He told his classmates his dad was a hero, the man who ran into burning buildings. On Father's Day, he scrawled in messy letters, "Thank you for saving people." I kept that card pressed between the pages of a Bible I rarely opened but couldn't let go of. When college came, I dipped into every corner of my savings, paid his tuition, covered his rent, even sent him money for books. I told him, education is the fire no one can put out. He nodded, grateful, or at least I thought so. I never minded the empty wallet. I minded the idea of him falling short of his potential. He never knew how many nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table, bills spread out like unpaid confessions. I even reached into places a man shouldn't have to. I pawned my father's watch, the one that ticked through every alarm bell of my career so he wouldn't miss a semester. My wedding ring stayed in a drawer, untouched, but I thought about it more than once. Everything in me believed that sacrifice was the only language of love. Looking back now, maybe that was the first mistake, teaching him that my pain was a currency he could spend. When he met the woman who would become his wife, I welcomed her family too. They needed help, and I opened my hands. Groceries, rent, hospital bills. I carried them as if blood made us kin. They smiled at me then, called me generous, called me family, words that feel like ash on my tongue now. I told myself it was temporary. One day, he'd stand on his own, and my shoulders could rest. One day, he'd remember who carried him through every storm. But storms have a way of rewriting people, and David, he learned not gratitude, but entitlement. And so the boy who once called me a hero grew into the man who left his own son shivering on a porch while he toasted champagne inside. I remember the long stretch of years when David was building his future, and I was the invisible scaffolding holding him up. College had drained me, but I didn't stop there. I worked overtime at the station, climbed ladders until my knees sang with fire, and came home to paperwork applications, rent contracts, credit statements, all in his name but carried on my back. I bought him his first car, a used sedan that ate more oil than it drank gas. He hated it, embarrassed to be seen in something that rattled like bones. So I traded my own truck, my pride, my partner through decades of alarms and winter roads, just to upgrade him to something shinier. He drove off with the windows down and the music up, and I told myself his smile was worth the silence of my own garage. When he wanted to propose, he said he didn't have enough saved. I reached into the small account where I'd been tucking away dollars for retirement. I handed it over without hesitation, telling him a man should never have to begin marriage in debt. I watched him kneel in a restaurant I couldn't afford to eat at, slipping a ring onto her finger that I had quietly purchased. He never told her where it came from. Maybe he never even admitted it to himself. After the wedding, I opened my home. Their small apartment felt too cramped, so they moved into my house for a year. I cooked, I fixed what broke, I tiptoed around so they could have privacy. When her parents stumbled under bills, I wrote checks to cover theirs too. Family helps family, I said. They nodded, grateful for about as long as it takes champagne to fizz out. Every Christmas, I played Santa for David, even when he was grown. I filled his stockings, left envelopes with cash tucked beneath ornaments, bought gifts I couldn't afford. I told myself it was tradition, that one day he'd understand the weight of what I carried. I painted on joy so he could unwrap it without guilt. But slowly, the distance grew. His calls became fewer, his visits shorter. He had a new family now, and the old one, the man who lit his path, was fading into the background. I brushed it off. I told myself it was the natural order of things, that children grow away from their parents. But something deeper had shifted. It wasn't just distance, it was erasure. I used to imagine he would tell his son about me, about the firefighter who never gave up, the father who built his life out of sacrifice. Instead, his boy sat on a porch in the snow, forgotten, while my son lifted a glass to toast a life I had bought for him. That was the night I understood. I hadn't raised a man who forgot where he came from. I had raised a man who decided I no longer existed. When David's business dreams began to take shape, he came to me like a desperate man clutching smoke. He had ideas, ambition, charm, but no money, no backbone to bear the weight of risk. And so once again, I bent my shoulders beneath his load. I mortgaged the family home, the house where his mother's laughter once filled the kitchen, where his first steps still echoed in my memory. Signing those papers felt like slicing pieces from my own flesh. But I told myself it was for him, for his future, for our bloodline. The money wasn't enough, not quite. Creditors circled him like wolves, and I dug deeper. I opened old boxes, pulled out treasures no man should ever have to sell. My firefighter helmet, dented and scarred from decades of battle. Commendation medals, the ones that once made David beam with pride when he told his friends his dad was a hero. Even photographs, frozen moments of smoke and triumph that I let go for pennies at pawnshops. Each item left my hands heavy with shame and my pockets too light to hold dignity. Still, I told myself sacrifice was what fathers did. He promised me everything. Dad, once this business takes off, I'll pay you back 10 times over. You'll never have to worry again. His words rang with the bright tone of certainty, and I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I looked at him then and still saw the boy who once held my hand crossing streets, the boy who once said I was invincible. I ignored the shadows of doubt creeping around his promises. At first, there was gratitude. Dinners where he raised a glass to me, to my sacrifices. Phone calls where he said, "You're the reason I can do this." For a brief season, I felt seen again, not as a burden, but as a foundation. But as the business grew, so did his distance. Gratitude faded into entitlement, then into silence. I remember the first time he corrected someone who asked about his success. "I built this from the ground up," he said, chest proud, voice smooth. No mention of the house I risked, the heirlooms I pawned, the nights I slept with worry pressing into my ribs like stone. Just him, just his genius, just his story. When I confronted him quietly, privately, he brushed me off with a laugh. "Dad, no one wants to hear about debts." It makes me look weak. I walked home that night beneath streetlights that hummed like accusations. I realized then, the man I had carried on my shoulders for decades was learning not to remember, but to erase. And as he erased me from his story, he erased the cost of his own soul. David's success came like a storm rolling in overnight, loud, unstoppable, and blind to the wreckage it left behind. One month he was begging me for help. The next he was driving a luxury car through the neighborhood, windows down so everyone could see. He bought tailored suits, watches that ticked louder than common sense, vacations to islands I'd only seen on postcards. And with each purchase, the distance between us grew wider. I was no longer welcome in his world. My phone calls went unanswered. My letters sat in drawers unopened. When I showed up at his office once, he looked at me like I was a beggar off the street, not the man who sold pieces of his own life to build the foundation beneath his feet. "Dad, you can't just come here," he said, eyes flicking toward his colleagues, as though my presence might stain him. He escorted me out with a smile so polished it cut. Holidays became lonelier. Thanksgiving dinners where my seat remained empty because the invitation never came. Birthdays celebrated in restaurants I couldn't afford, where there was no extra chair for me. Christmas mornings I spent alone with instant coffee, staring at the tree lights, pretending the silence was peace. The boy who once clung to my leg now lived in houses I had helped him afford, yet barred me from crossing their thresholds. Neighbors whispered about his wealth. They congratulated me, told me I must be proud. I nodded, but inside I carried a truth too bitter to speak. I had raised a man who believed loyalty ended when money began. I had built him a ladder, and he climbed it so high that he looked down and no longer saw me at the bottom. One night, I passed by his home. Through the glowing windows, I saw laughter, glasses raised, friends gathered around him. For a moment, I wanted to believe he might still glance out, spot me on the sidewalk, and wave me in. But his eyes never turned toward the glass. His life went on without me, polished and perfect, as if I were already buried. And yet, in the deepest part of me, something stirred, not anger, not yet, just a quiet realization. I had sacrificed youth, health, money, and memory. And still, it wasn't enough. Nothing ever would be. That Christmas night, when I found my grandson freezing on the porch, I finally understood the full truth. David hadn't just forgotten me. He had learned to discard anyone who no longer served his story. And that made him dangerous not just to me, but to his own child. The man I once trusted with my legacy had become the man I would have to stand against. The night I carried my grandson away from that house, his small body pressed against my chest, I could feel every sacrifice I had made burning back through me. It was as if the cold itself was reminding me of all the winters I had already endured for David, the winters of debt, of humiliation, of silence I swallowed just to keep him afloat. I remembered the creditors, their voices sharp, demanding, echoing down the phone line while I stood in my kitchen staring at overdue bills. David had maxed out his credit cards, spent money he didn't have, but when the wolves circled, it was me they bit. I begged them for time, begged them for mercy. A retired firefighter, hands scarred from heat, begging men in suits for an extra week to pay what wasn't even mine. I pawned things no one should ever have to pawn: watches, medals, tools. Each time I handed something over the counter, the clerk's eyes looked at me like I was just another man drowning. He didn't know those items carried my entire history. He didn't know the helmet he weighed in his hand had once saved lives. To him, it was just metal. To me, it was memory, stripped away for cash that disappeared into my son's pockets. Neighbors talked, of course. They saw David climbing, hosting parties, driving cars with leather seats and tinted windows. They saw me walking home from the store with discount groceries and assumed I was proud, that I was content to watch my son shine. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that I skipped meals so David could eat steak, that I wore the same coat for 15 years while he bought new suits every season. They didn't know the shame of it, the kind that eats you alive in silence. I remember lying awake some nights, the phone silent beside me, wondering if he would ever call just to ask how I was. But the silence stretched, long and punishing, and I filled it with excuses. He's busy. He's building his life. He'll come around. Excuses became lullabies, I whispered to myself until they stopped working. And still, I gave. I gave until my body felt hollow, until even my pride was stripped for parts. Because I was a father. Because I thought that's what love meant. But love should not leave a man starving while his son feasts. Love should not demand that a man beg on his knees while his child raises a glass in his name. Those years carved me into something I barely recognized, and as I held my grandson tighter against the cold, I knew I had lived my life on fire for a son who had only ever learned how to let me burn. There are objects a man should never have to part with, yet I sold mine piece by piece, as if I were dismantling my own history to keep David's dream alive. I can still see the counter at the pawn shop, scratched wood, buzzing neon light, and the clerk's hand weighing my firefighter helmet as if it were nothing more than scrap metal. That helmet had carried me into flames, had seen me crawl through smoke to pull strangers back into life. It had earned medals, newspaper clippings, nods of respect from neighbors who once called me a hero. And there I was, watching it vanish for a fraction of what it was worth, just so David's rent would be paid for another month. The medals went next, gold-plated circles that meant survival, honor, and nights when the fire took everything but us. I remember how David's eyes used to shine when I showed them to him as a boy. "That's my dad," he would say, puffing out his chest. He never knew that years later I would hand them over, one by one, to a stranger who didn't care about the story behind the shine. Photographs, too. Black and white images of my early crew, faces long gone now. The clerk didn't even want them, tossed them aside as worthless. But to me, they were proof that I had belonged to something bigger once, that my life had been more than just sacrifice for a son who had forgotten me. I picked them up from the floor and kept them, sliding them back into my coat pocket, like a man hiding his wounds. Each sale felt like pulling a nail from the frame of a house, the structure weakening with every piece gone. I told myself it was temporary, that David would make it, that the money was an investment in a future where we both could breathe. I fed myself that lie until it soured in my mouth. I remember the hollowness that followed each pawn ticket, the way my pockets jingled with coins when they should have been filled with meaning. I walked home lighter, yes, but not in any way a man wants to be. My neighbors would nod at me, say, "Proud of your boy," and I'd nod back, keeping my shame tucked behind my teeth. Love, I learned, can demand too much. It can strip a man of his trophies, his tools, his time, until all he has left is the quiet hope that one day his son will understand what was lost. But David never asked. He never wanted to know. And I kept feeding the fire until there was nothing left but ash. The one bright ember in those years was the birth of my grandson. I can still recall the first time I held him, tiny, red-faced, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of detergent and new beginnings. His cry was sharp, but when I laid a rough finger against his palm, he wrapped it tight, as if he already knew who I was. In that moment, I thought everything I had sacrificed was worth it. David had built a family, and I would finally see the reward for all my years of burning myself out for him. I babysat often in those early days. I changed diapers, sang lullabies in my cracked voice, and walked circles in the living room while his parents went out to dinners or parties. I didn't mind. Every time he laughed, it was like hearing a sound I thought the world had taken from me when my wife passed. His little giggle became the only music I needed. He gave me a reason to stay alive when loneliness crept too close. But then came the shifts, subtle at first, like shadows lengthening at dusk. David's wife began making comments. "He's too old-fashioned," she would say, when I tried to teach the boy simple things like tying his shoes or saying grace before meals. She claimed I was spoiling him with my stories, that my ways belonged to another time. Her smile was polite but sharp, her eyes always measuring what I was worth in their new, glittering world. Soon, visits became less frequent. I would call and ask to see him, and excuses would pile up: too busy, too tired, too many plans. I told myself not to push, not to cause friction. But inside, I ached. That little boy was my second chance at family, my reason to believe that the sacrifices hadn't been in vain. I remember one afternoon vividly. I arrived with a small wooden toy I had carved myself, nothing fancy, just something made with love and calloused hands. My grandson's eyes lit up when I placed it in his hands, but his mother frowned, whispering to David, "He doesn't need junk like this. We can buy him something better." The boy looked between us, confused, clutching the toy tighter, as if he understood the difference between bought and made. That was when I realized they weren't just keeping me at a distance. They were trying to erase me from his life, the same way David had begun erasing me from his own story. To them, I wasn't family anymore. I was an inconvenience, a relic, a man whose love didn't fit their perfect picture. But every time my grandson reached for me, every time his little hands searched for mine, I knew one truth. I was the only one who would never leave him shivering in the cold. And that truth would one day burn brighter than all their polished lies. The slow exile began so quietly I almost missed it. One holiday skipped, one birthday forgotten. At first, I made excuses for David. "He's busy," I told myself. "He has responsibilities now." But deep down, I knew. The distance wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. I remember walking past their house one Thanksgiving, the windows glowing with golden light. Shadows moved across the curtains, figures laughing, plates being passed, glasses lifted in toast. I had baked a pie that morning, pumpkin the way David liked it as a boy. I carried it halfway down the street before I stopped, realizing I had nowhere to bring it. No invitation had come, no phone call, nothing. I turned back home, the pie cooling untouched on my kitchen counter, the silence in my house louder than the laughter spilling from his. It was the same at birthdays. I sent cards that were never answered, small gifts that were never acknowledged. The few times I called, his wife's voice answered. "It's not a good time," she'd say, as though a father's love were an inconvenience. Eventually, even those calls stopped being picked up at all. The line just rang and rang, each unanswered ring driving a nail deeper into the coffin of what we once had. And when I showed up, when I dared to knock on their door, I saw the flicker of irritation in David's eyes. "You can't just drop in," he said, not cruel, not loud, but firm, as though I were a stranger imposing on his life. "We have our own plans, our own friends, our own lives, our own lives." The words stung worse than any fire ever had. I had given him my life, piece by piece, until I barely had one left to claim. Now he said it as if I had never been part of his, as if I were some relic of the past that no longer fit in the polished world he'd built. I walked home in silence that night. The streets were lined with Christmas lights, but they blurred in my eyes until they looked like flames. I had fought real fires, carried men out of burning buildings, and never once flinched at the heat. But nothing burned like that walk home, realizing my son had closed his door not just to me, but to everything we once were. From then on, I stopped expecting the phone to ring, stopped waiting for invitations, stopped pretending I belonged in the picture. Instead, I carried my memories alone, like ashes in my hands, too heavy to scatter and too precious to keep. I can still hear the knock I made on his door that evening. It wasn't loud, not insistent, just the kind of knock a father gives when he believes his son will be glad to see him. But when David opened the door, the look on his face told me otherwise. His smile was practiced, polite, meant for neighbors or colleagues, not for me. "You can't just drop in," he said. His voice was steady, calm, but it carried a sharpness underneath. I searched his eyes for softness, for even a flicker of the boy who once clung to my jacket on the first day of school. All I found was impatience. I stood there holding a casserole dish, still warm, something I'd cooked with trembling hands because I thought they might like it. He didn't take it from me. He didn't even glance at it. He just stood blocking the doorway, making it clear I had arrived uninvited. Behind him, I heard the television, the faint chatter of his wife on the phone. Family life continued without me, wrapped in comfort I had helped pay for. My grandson's laugh carried from the back of the house, and for a moment I thought David might step aside, might let me through just so I could see the boy's face. But he didn't move. "We have our own lives now," he said again, as if repeating it would carve the boundary deeper. "You can't expect to be part of everything. Everything. I had been part of everything since the day he was born. His scraped knees, his first car, his tuition bills, his wedding ring, all of it had my fingerprints burned into it. And now, with one dismissive sentence, he shoved me outside the border of his world. I wanted to argue, to remind him of the nights I'd carried him half asleep from the car, of the hours I sat in hospital rooms when fevers spiked, of the thousands of meals I had skipped so he wouldn't. But the words wouldn't leave my throat. They clung there like smoke, heavy and choking. Because deep down, I already knew they wouldn't matter. Gratitude wasn't part of his language anymore. So I nodded, turned, and walked back down the steps. The casserole cooled in my hands as the door closed behind me. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting long shadows across the snow. I walked home without looking back, my breath fogging the air, my heart beating slower with every step. That night, I didn't eat. I set the dish on my counter and left it there until the food grew cold and stiff. I sat in the dark, listening to the silence, and understood for the first time that my son wasn't just busy, he was gone. And I was no longer his father in anything but name. It wasn't just the silence of being shut out that gnawed at me, it was the weight of my own body failing me. Years of smoke and heat had left scars on my lungs, aches in my bones. I felt it more with every season. Climbing stairs winded me. Nights grew longer, filled with coughing fits that shook the walls. Hospital bills began to pile up on the counter, paper stacked on paper like accusations I couldn't answer. And yet, through all of it, David never asked how I was. Not once. My phone never lit up with his name, not even when neighbors knew I'd been admitted overnight for chest pain. I told myself he didn't know, but of course he did. The whole family knew, he just didn't care enough to call. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a mistake somewhere so terrible it had poisoned the bond between us. Maybe I had given too much. Maybe I had made sacrifice look too easy, so he believed it cost me nothing. Or maybe I had raised a man who thought love was measured only in money, and when the money stopped, so did the love. I tried to convince myself he was simply busy, too tangled in his own success. But excuses ran out when the chest pains returned and I sat alone in a hospital bed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, no visitors at my side. Nurses asked if anyone was coming. I smiled and said no, pretending it didn't matter, pretending I was used to the loneliness. But inside, I was breaking in a way no doctor could fix. One night, I whispered into the dark, "Did I raise my own enemy?" The words sounded foreign, bitter, but true. Because what else do you call a man who leaves his father to crumble under debts and illness while he sips champagne in glass towers? What else do you call a son who shuts the door on the very man who kept it open his whole life? I was a firefighter for 30 years. I faced infernos, collapsed buildings, storms of smoke. But nothing was harder to survive than the slow, suffocating realization that my own child had abandoned me, not out of ignorance, but out of choice. That Christmas Eve, before I ever set foot on his porch, humiliation already clung to me like the frost on my coat. I had walked through the neighborhood carrying a gift wrapped in paper I bought with coins scraped from the bottom of a jar. Neighbors saw me and smiled with pity. They thought I was on my way to join David's celebration. to bask in the glow of the family I had raised. They didn't know I wasn't invited. They didn't know I would stand outside, gift in hand, like a beggar waiting for crumbs. I remember standing on the sidewalk, staring up at the lit windows. Laughter spilled out. Glasses clinked. Music hummed. From where I stood, it looked warm and golden, the kind of Christmas you see on postcards. And yet, I was on the outside, my breath fogging in the cold, my hands stiff from clutching a box meant for a grandson I wasn't sure I'd be allowed to see. When I finally reached the door, the sound hit me hardest, the joy inside versus the silence in my chest. I knocked once, twice. No answer. The music only swelled. Then I heard it, a small sound, fragile and wrong. I looked down and saw him, my grandson, curled on the porch, barefoot, holding a toy snapped clean in half. His lips were blue, his eyes watery, but he didn't cry. He just looked at me as if I was the only person left in the world who could keep him safe. My heart split clean down the middle. All the sacrifices, all the years of silence, all the humiliation I had endured, it all sharpened into that one moment. My son had not only abandoned me, he had abandoned his own child. And the neighbors, who thought I was on my way to a joyful reunion, watched from their windows as if I were the tragedy of the night. That was the evening something inside me shifted. No more excuses. No more silence. No more pretending that sacrifice was enough to earn love. As I picked up my grandson and held him against my chest, I swore to myself the fire of this betrayal would not die quietly. I would not be pitied anymore. The man who had once fought flames for strangers would now fight with the law for his own blood. That was the night I stopped being only a... In the weeks after that Christmas night, I couldn't shake the image of my grandson's bare feet on the frozen porch. It haunted me in every quiet moment, louder than the ringing silence of all the years David had abandoned me. But this time, I didn't just bury the pain. I let it guide me, steady as a compass, pointing towards something I had long forgotten, the truth. I began sorting through old boxes in my attic, the kind you stack and forget until dust becomes their only company. They were filled with remnants of my life papers from the firehouse, my wife's recipes written in her looping hand, report cards with David's childish scrawl. And then, under a stack of yellowed bank statements, I found an envelope. My name on the front, faded ink, corners curled with age. Inside were documents I had tucked away years before, mortgage papers, loan agreements, and one sheet that made my hands still, the deed to the very house David and his family lived in. I read it once, then again. My name stared back at me, bold and unyielding. The transfer David had promised to complete the one he assured me was already done had never been filed. On paper, in the eyes of the law, the house was still mine. For a long time, I sat in that attic with the paper trembling in my hands. Anger surged, yes, but beneath it was something colder, cleaner. The years of sacrifice had left me hollow, but this discovery filled me with a new kind of fire, the kind that doesn't consume, but illuminates. I had been erased from David's story, but here was proof that I had never truly left it. The house he flaunted, the one he called his empire, the stage for his parties and pretenses, it was built on a lie. My silence, my trust. And now, with the weight of the deed in my hand, I realized I held something David could not erase, something he could not charm away or bury under his money. It wasn't revenge that stirred in me that night, it was justice. And for the first time in years, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, solid and steady, as if the earth itself was reminding me who I was. I wasn't just a father discarded. I wasn't just a man forgotten. I was the rightful owner of the fire he thought he controlled. Finding that deed was like unearthing a buried ember. It glowed in my mind, hot with memory. I sat there in the attic, staring at it, and every detail of how it came to be returned to me. I remembered the day David asked me to mortgage the house, his voice urgent, his hands waving with promises. "It's temporary, Dad. Just until the business takes off. You'll be secured. Everything will be fine." I had trusted him. I had believed him. The bank meetings were a blur of signatures and fine print, but I walked away thinking I had simply shifted ownership, moved the house into his name so he could build a future. He told me it was all handled, that the paperwork was complete. I never questioned it. I wanted to believe my son was telling me the truth. But as I read those old papers again, I realized the truth was something colder. The transfer had never been finished. My name remained etched in ink, binding and absolute. Legally, that house, the one with the glowing windows I wasn't welcome to enter, was still mine. Every party, every toast, Every luxury enjoyed under that roof had been built on an illusion. He hadn't built anything at all. He had borrowed. From me, from my silence. I sat in that attic for hours, the sound of wind scraping against the shingles, the weight of realization pressing against my chest. All those years of being erased, of being told I no longer belonged, and yet in the eyes of the law I was the foundation of it all. David's empire wasn't his, it was mine, still anchored in my sacrifices. The thought made my hands shake not with rage, but with clarity. For so long, I had wondered if I was powerless, if I was destined to fade away, while my son rewrote the story of our family without me. But here was proof that I had never truly been erased. He had tried to bury me, but he had left the deed unfinished, and in that single mistake, he had left me the weapon he never imagined I would use. I pressed the paper flat on my knee, running a finger across the ink of my own name. It felt steady, stronger than memory, stronger than blood, and for the first time in years, I smiled, not with joy, not with triumph, but with the calm certainty of a man who has found his ground again. David thought he had erased me, but the law had not, and soon neither would anyone else. The morning after I uncovered the deed, I carried it to a lawyer. My hands shook as I slid the envelope across his desk, not from fear, but from the weight of 30 years finally finding its voice. He unfolded the paper, adjusted his glasses, and read it twice before looking up at me. "Mr. Miller," he said slowly, "this house is still yours." The words landed heavy, like the sound of a gavel striking wood. I had suspected it, but to hear it confirmed by law made my chest tighten. All those nights I'd walked past David's glowing windows, convinced I was nothing but a shadow. All those times I had been treated like a ghost in the very home I built suddenly. The truth cut through the fog. I wasn't a ghost. I was the owner. The lawyer leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Has your son been paying you rent?" I almost laughed. Rent? Number, not a cent. I had been the one paying my sweat, my sacrifices, my silence footing every bill. David had been living in my house as if it were his kingdom, but he was no king. He was a squatter dressed in silk, and the ground he stood on had never belonged to him. The lawyer tapped the deed with his pen. "You understand what this means? Legally, you could reclaim the property. If he's been misrepresenting ownership, there are grounds for action. Strong ones." I sat there in silence, the hum of the office clock ticking like a countdown. For years I had felt powerless, stripped bare by betrayal. But now, power shifted in my hands as easily as that single sheet of paper. I nodded. "Yes, I understand." The lawyer studied me for a long moment, maybe expecting anger, maybe expecting bitterness, but what he saw instead was something colder, quieter. I didn't rage, I didn't shout. I simply folded the deed back into its envelope and tucked it against my chest like armor. In that moment, I stopped being a man begging for scraps of love. I became a man with proof, with leverage, with a weapon hidden in plain sight. And I knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had walked through fire before, that David's world was about to burn not with flames, but with truth. After leaving the lawyer's office, I knew I couldn't rely on memory alone. I needed evidence, hard, undeniable proof of every sacrifice, every dollar, every promise David had twisted into his own gain. So I went back into the boxes, into drawers I hadn't opened in years, and I began to gather receipts, old bank slips, copies of tuition checks written in my shaky handwriting, bills for car insurance. I had paid long after David promised to take responsibility. I even found the loan statements where I had borrowed against my own pension to cover his credit card debts. Line after line, they told a story he had tried to bury. Not a story of his success, but of my sacrifice. There were letters, too, thank you notes written in his early 20s, words that had once filled me with pride. "Couldn't have done it without you, Dad." I read them again with new eyes. Gratitude had been fleeting, quickly replaced by expectation. What was once thank you had turned into of course. Of course Dad will help. Of course Dad will pay. Of course Dad will be there to clean up the mess. I placed every document into a binder, each page slipping into a plastic sleeve. With each edition, I felt like I was building a weapon, not a gun, not a blade, but something sharper. Truth, evidence, the kind no one could argue with, the kind that would hold up in the only place David's lies couldn't reach, a courtroom. I kept stacking until the binder was thick, heavy enough to make my arms ache when I carried it. And still, I wasn't finished. I began keeping a journal of my memories, dates, times, places where I had bailed him out, Not just for me, but for my grandson. One day, he would need to know the truth that his father's kingdom wasn't built. It was borrowed, brick by brick, from the man he had cast aside. When I was done, I placed the binder beside the deed, two weapons, waiting in silence. Proof of who truly owned the house, proof of who had truly paid the cost. Together, they were stronger than anger, stronger than grief. Together, they gave me something I hadn't felt in years: control. I sat back in my chair, the papers stacked like ammunition before me. For the first time, I didn't feel like a man left behind. I felt like a man preparing for battle. And this time, I wouldn't be the one burning. David would. The deeper I dug, the clearer the cracks in David's empire became. His wealth, the thing he paraded so proudly, was built on nothing more than borrowed time and borrowed names. I had always assumed he was thriving, that his business was as solid as the granite countertops he flaunted. But paperwork has a way of telling the truth that appearances cannot hide. Through public records and documents my lawyer helped me obtain, I saw the rot. Loans stacked on loans, debts shuffled from one account to another. He owed more than he owned. Creditors lurked at the edges of his glittering life, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even the cars he bragged about weren't fully his leased under contracts that could vanish with a missed payment. The vacations, the champagne, the suits, they were all smoke and mirrors. I found bank statements too, proof of reckless spending. Thousands poured into parties, into luxury restaurants, into meaningless things that vanished the moment the bill was paid. He lived like the world owed him joy, and he believed no one would ever dare call the debt due. But I knew better, because beneath all his bravado, the foundation was mine, the house was mine, the sacrifices were mine. As I pieced it all together, I felt the coldest kind of clarity. David hadn't just erased me, he had built his entire life on the assumption that I would stay silent, that I would never challenge him, that I would go quietly into the night, carrying my shame alone while he danced in the light of a lie. But the numbers didn't lie, the records didn't lie, and soon, no one else would be able to lie on his behalf either. I slid the latest papers into the binder, the weight of it now heavy enough to break a lesser man's resolve. But mine only grew steadier, because I saw it clearly now. David wasn't untouchable. He was fragile, more fragile than he could ever admit. His empire wasn't a fortress, it was a house of cards. And I was holding the one truth that could bring it all down. The law was on my side, the evidence was mine. And David had no idea that his time was already running out. When I returned to the lawyer with the binder in one hand and the deed in the other, he studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Miller," he said, "you've built a case stronger than most I've ever seen." He wasn't exaggerating. Every receipt, every bank slip, every record of my sacrifices painted a picture so clear that even David's silver tongue couldn't smear it. The lawyer laid it out in simple terms. You can reclaim the house immediately, file for repossession, expose his debts, freeze his accounts until he can prove legal ownership, which he cannot, and with proof of neglect toward his son, you could even pursue custody. Custody! The word hit me harder than any gavel. For years, I had been kept at arm's length, treated like an outsider in my grandson's life. But the law, the very thing David thought he was above, was now tilting in my favor. My sacrifices weren't just memories anymore, they were ammunition. And that boy, the one left shivering on a porch, deserved more than a father who used him as a prop between toasts. The lawyer slid the deed back to me. "This isn't revenge, Mr. Miller. This is justice. You've been carrying him for decades. Now it's time to stand." Justice. The word tasted clean, sharper than bitterness, steadier than rage. I wasn't plotting to ruin him out of spite. I wasn't trying to steal something that wasn't mine. I was taking back what had always been mine, my home, my dignity, my grandson's chance at a life without neglect. For the first time in years, I felt steady. My heart didn't race with anger. My hands didn't tremble with grief. I was calm, clear, unshakable. I had walked through real flames before. Now I was walking through lies, and the truth was my shield. As I left the office, snow falling softly on my shoulders, I knew this wasn't just the beginning of a fight. It was the end of pretending. David had written me off as weak, disposable. But weakness doesn't gather evidence. Weakness doesn't walk into a lawyer's office with 30 years of sacrifice bound in a binder. Weakness doesn't reclaim what's his. This wasn't weakness. This was the reckoning he never saw coming. The days that followed were quiet, but inside me something had shifted forever. I no longer woke with the weight of shame pressing on my chest. I no longer replayed David's words, the slammed doors, the unanswered calls. Instead, I woke with clarity, with purpose. The binder of evidence sat on my kitchen table, the deed beside it, and every time I looked at them, I felt steadier. Not vengeful, not bitter, just ready. I thought about David, about the arrogance that dripped from his smile, about the way he carried himself as though the world were his to command. He had no idea. He didn't know that the ground beneath him was mine, that the walls around him still belonged to me. He didn't know that every dollar he flaunted was tied to receipts that had my name on them. He didn't know that the silence he mistook for weakness had turned into something sharper than rage, resolve. I spent those evenings in silence, not plotting like a man bent on destruction, but preparing like a man who had faced flames before. When you walk into a burning building, you don't scream at the fire. You don't curse it, you study it, you move with patience. You know that one wrong move can cost everything, and so I treated this the same way. Calm, measured, certain. There was no thrill in what I had discovered, no joy in the thought of reclaiming what was mine. There was only necessity. My grandson's face haunted me, his small hands clutching that broken toy, his lips blue from the cold. He deserved better. He deserved safety, stability, love the kind that doesn't shut him out in the snow. And if David wouldn't give it to him, then I would, legally, permanently. I no longer saw myself as the forgotten father, the man erased from his own family. I saw myself for what I truly was, the rightful owner, the keeper of truth, the one holding the weapon David could never defend against. Not a fist, not fire, not fury, but the law. And when the time came to act, I would not shout. I would not rage. I would simply step forward, place the truth on the table, and let silence do the rest. Because sometimes the coldest justice doesn't roar, it whispers. And that whisper was already echoing in David's walls, whether he knew it or not. Christmas came again before I made my move. The snow fell heavy that evening, the same way it had when I found my grandson abandoned on the porch. This time, though, I wasn't carrying a gift. I was carrying the truth. I walked up the driveway slowly, each step deliberate, my boots crunching in the snow like a drumbeat. Through the windows, I saw the glow of lights, the shimmer of ornaments, the gathering of people who believed they were safe inside their fortress of lies. David stood at the center, glass in hand, laughter spilling from his mouth like cheap champagne. I pushed the door open without knocking. Heat rushed toward me, along with silence. The party froze, just as it had the year before. Faces turned pale, conversations died mid-sentence, and David's smile faltered. This time, I wasn't holding my grandson. I was holding a folder thick with papers, the deed, the receipts, the records of every sacrifice I had made. I set it on the coffee table with a thud that echoed louder than any shout. "You remember last year?" I said, my voice calm, steady. "You left your son outside. You left me outside. But the truth never stayed out here with us. It stayed inside, buried in the walls you think belong to you." David stepped forward, his hand twitching as if he could snatch the folder before anyone else saw it. But I raised my hand, stopping him cold. "This is mine," I said, tapping the folder. "The house, the proof, the years you erased, they all belong to me, and tonight everyone here will know it." Murmurs rippled through the room, his wife's face drained of color. Friends shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between me and the papers. The silence grew sharp enough to cut. David tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "Dad, don't do this here. Not in front of everyone." I leaned closer, my voice low but clear enough for every ear in the room. "The time for silence is over. You built your kingdom on my back. But tonight, the truth walks through your door." I stepped back, leaving the folder open on the table. The documents fanned out like cards in a hand he could never beat. The evidence spoke louder than anger ever could. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to rage. All I had to do was stand in the warmth of the room he thought was his, holding the proof that it was never his at all. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of the papers settled over everyone. I didn't have to explain the documents. Anyone with eyes could see the truth written in black ink. The deed, the bank slips, the loan agreements, the receipts of every sacrifice I had made while David strutted through life as if he had built it all himself. His wife was the first to move, reaching for the folder as if she could close it, hide it, make the truth disappear. But I placed my hand on it firmly, pinning it to the table. "No, I said, my voice steady. "Everyone here should see." The guests exchanged uneasy looks. Some leaned closer, scanning the pages. A murmur ran through the crowd. Words like debt, ownership, fraud slipping into the air. David's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. He tried to smile, to wave it off as some misunderstanding. "It's just old paperwork. Out of date. My father doesn't understand." But I cut him off with a single sentence. "The law understands." I pulled a sealed envelope from my coat pocket and dropped it beside the folder. Inside were the filings, legal documents my lawyer had prepared, notices of repossession, claims for repayment, evidence ready for court. The sound of the envelope hitting the table was louder than any gavel. Whispers grew sharper now. Friends shifted, some stepping back from David, as though betrayal might be contagious. Others stared at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. The kind of respect a man earns not by shouting, but by standing unshaken in the storm. David lunged for the papers, but one of his so-called friends stopped him, muttering, "You said this house was yours." The doubt was spreading, unraveling the threads of the image he had worked so hard to weave. I straightened my coat, looking at each face in turn. "You've all celebrated in this house, toasted to David's success. But every wall around you, every light above you, every inch of this floor, it was mine. Paid for with my sweat, my years, my silence. And now, it's mine again." The words landed heavier than any accusation. I didn't need to yell. The truth was louder than noise. By the time I turned toward the door, I could feel it, the shift. Allies peeling away, their loyalty dissolving. The fortress David thought he had built was already crumbling, and all I had done was open the door and let the truth walk in. By the next morning, the whispers had already turned into wildfire. News of the papers spread faster than I could have imagined. Friends who once clung to David's side began to disappear, one by one, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The phone calls he used to brag about the invitations, the deals, the partnerships, they dried up within days. His business associates, the ones who toasted him at the very table where I laid down the truth, wanted nothing to do with him now. They had invested in an image, and that image cracked the moment they realized the foundation was a lie. A man can wear a suit, drive a car, drink the finest champagne, but when the ground beneath him doesn't belong to him, no one wants to stand too close. I didn't have to lift a finger. I simply watched as silence worked harder than anger ever could. Every time David reached for help, another ally pulled their hand back. Every time he tried to explain, his voice sounded thinner, weaker, more desperate. His wife stopped posting photographs of lavish dinners. The friends who filled their house with laughter no longer came through the door. Neighbors who once nodded with admiration now whispered with pity. And still, I said nothing. The documents spoke for me. The truth, once exposed, didn't need my help to finish the work. I would see him sometimes driving past my street, slower than before. His windows rolled up tight. The shine on his car seemed duller, as though it knew the man behind the wheel wasn't what he claimed to be. I didn't wave. He didn't stop. We passed each other like strangers, but he knew. He knew who had lit the match that burned through his masquerade. I didn't take joy in it. Not exactly. What I felt was colder, steadier. The satisfaction of balance being restored. For years, I had carried the shame, the weight of silence, the humiliation of being erased. Now it was his turn, and the silence pressing in on him was heavier than anything I could have spoken aloud. His empire of allies was gone. His fortress of lies had no walls left to hold it up. And all I had done was tell the truth. The reckoning had only just begun. The collapse of David's reputation was only the beginning. My lawyer moved swiftly, filing the claims and petitions we had prepared. Within weeks, the house was under legal review, and notices were sent to freeze accounts tied to fraudulent ownership. For the first time in his life, David couldn't swipe a card and make the problem disappear. I watched it unfold with the same calm I once carried into burning buildings. Bank accounts locked, credit lines severed. His wife's favorite boutiques declined her purchases. The vacations they had booked evaporated in a flood of canceled reservations. The life they had wrapped themselves in silk, marble, champagne crumbled in silence, not fire. When David realized what was happening, he stormed into my lawyer's office, voice raised, charm sharpened like a blade. But charm means nothing in the face of evidence. Every page, every receipt, every signature bore down on him until his anger had nowhere to land. The law did not flinch. It did not care about his charisma. It cared about ink and truth. His wife's voice turned shrill. Friends whispered about bankruptcy. about fraud, doors closed on him the way he had once closed his door on me. And I, for the first time in decades, felt no shame, no humiliation, only balance being restored. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I walked through each day quietly, with the knowledge that justice was finally taking shape. I bought groceries with cash earned honestly. I shoveled snow from my own driveway, and while I did, David scrambled to hold together the life he thought was unbreakable. The man who once laughed at my silence was now suffocated by his own. He had mocked me for living simply, for giving too much. But, in the end, it was his greed that starved him, not my sacrifice. And as the accounts froze and the house slipped back into my name, I knew this was only the middle of the reckoning. The fire had just begun to spread. The collapse of David's reputation was only the beginning. My lawyer moved swiftly, filing the claims and petitions we had prepared. Within weeks, the house was under legal review, and notices were sent to freeze accounts tied to fraudulent ownership. For the first time in his life, David couldn't swipe a card and make the problem disappear. I watched it unfold with the same calm I once carried into burning buildings. Bank accounts locked, credit lines severed. His wife's favorite boutiques declined her purchases. The vacations they had booked evaporated in a flood of canceled reservations. The life they had wrapped themselves in silk, marble, champagne crumbled in silence, not fire. When David realized what was happening, he stormed into my lawyer's office, voice raised, charm sharpened like a blade. But charm means nothing in the face of evidence. Every page, every receipt, every signature bore down on him until his anger had nowhere to land. The law did not flinch. It did not care about his charisma. It cared about ink and truth. His wife's voice turned shrill. Friends whispered about bankruptcy, about fraud. Doors closed on him the way he had once closed his door on me. And I, for the first time in decades, felt no shame, no humiliation, only balance being restored. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I walked through each day quietly, with the knowledge that justice was finally taking shape. I bought groceries with cash earned honestly. I shoveled snow from my own driveway. And while I did, David scrambled to hold together the life he thought was unbreakable. The man who once laughed at my silence was now suffocated by his own. He had mocked me for living simply, for giving too much. But in the end, it was his greed that starved him, not my sacrifice. And as the accounts froze and the house slipped back into my name, I knew this was only the middle of the reckoning. The fire had just begun to spread. The silence in David's house grew heavier with each passing day. Where once there had been parties, laughter, and music spilling through the windows, now there were shadows moving behind drawn curtains. His wife no longer smiled at neighbors. His son's toys no longer scattered across the yard. The house, once a monument to their arrogance, had become a cage. Meanwhile, I moved deliberately. My lawyer advised patience, but I knew silence could be more powerful than confrontation. Word spread that I held the deed, that I had filed for repossession. David tried to deny it, tried to convince anyone who would listen that it was a misunderstanding, but no one believed him. The documents were too clear, the proof too solid. One by one, people withdrew from his orbit. Former business partners refused his calls. Friends who once filled his living room with cheer crossed the street rather than meet his eyes. Even family from his wife's side, people I had once supported with my own money, chose distance over loyalty. Isolation crept in until all that remained was the echo of his own voice, growing sharper, more desperate, inside empty rooms. I never raised my voice. I never sought revenge in the shadows. I simply let the truth breathe, and in the open air, it choked his lies. My lawyer called it strategy. I called it balance. For years, I had been silenced, erased, treated as though I no longer existed. Now it was David's turn to feel what it meant to be invisible. I saw him once at the grocery store. He walked in quickly, no tailored suit, no polished shoes. Just a man in a wrinkled jacket, looking over his shoulder as though everyone was watching him. And they were. Whispers trailed behind him down the aisles. He didn't buy much, just a few basics. No champagne, no imported delicacies. He paid in cash, his hands trembling as though even the bills no longer wanted to touch him. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. Our eyes met across the checkout lanes, and in that moment, he knew. He knew I had taken back the ground beneath his feet, without ever lifting a weapon. He knew the silence closing in on him was mine. And as I stepped out into the cold evening air, I realized something. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply waited, steady and patient, until the lies collapsed under their own weight. David was collapsing, and I hadn't even begun the final strike. The repossession notice arrived on David's doorstep like a final winter storm. I didn't deliver it myself, no, I let the courts do what they were built to do. But I imagined the sound of the envelope sliding across his table, the way his hands must have trembled as he unfolded the letter that declared, in no uncertain terms, the house was no longer his to claim. Neighbors noticed first. They saw the officials arrive, papers in hand, their badges gleaming in the weak sunlight. They watched David argue, his voice raised, his gestures frantic. But the law does not bend for theatrics. By the time the officials left, every eye on the street knew the truth. The house he had flaunted, the castle he had built his image upon, was never his at all. I didn't need to be there. I sat at my own kitchen table, drinking black coffee, while the silence outside grew heavier. My lawyer called later that day to confirm the repossession had gone through. The house was mine again, sealed and stamped by the very system David thought he could outrun. His wife packed bags within the week. I saw her car leave the driveway one final time, trunk loaded, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She had married a man who promised wealth and delivered ruin. Loyalty built on money collapses when the money turns to dust. David stayed, though. He clung to the walls like a man trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. But the tide had already swept him under. His accounts frozen, his friends gone, his family fractured. The house, my house, was no longer his fortress. It was evidence of his downfall. I walked past one evening and saw him through the window, sitting alone at the dining table, the chandelier above casting light on papers scattered before him. Not contracts, not deals, just bills. Stacks of them. He sat hunched, his head in his hands, as though the weight of his own lies had finally crushed him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply kept walking, the snow crunching steady beneath my boots. For years, I had been the man left out in the cold. Now it was his turn to feel the frost seep into his bones. The difference was, I had always endured the cold with dignity. David had never known how. And that was why the silence, the shame, and the emptiness of that house would consume him long before I ever set foot inside again. The day the court officially transferred the house back into my name, I stood outside on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the front door. Snow drifted across the porch where, a year before, I had found my grandson shivering. The sight made my chest tighten, but not with sorrow, with resolve. David answered the door when I finally knocked. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The arrogance that once dripped from his smile was gone, replaced by the raw panic of a man who had lost everything he thought was his. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us carried decades of sacrifice and betrayal. Finally, I handed him the official papers. "It's done," I said. "The house is mine again." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His hands shook as he scanned the document, his lips pressing into a thin, pale line. Behind him, the rooms that once hosted laughter and clinking glasses were barren boxes stacked in corners, curtains drawn tight against the world. His wife was gone. His friends were gone. All that remained was him, standing in the ruins of a life built on lies. "I need time," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You've had time," I answered. My tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm. "Final. Decades of it. I gave you everything, and you threw it away. This is expired, and this is gold him." He looked at me then with eyes I didn't recognize, not the boy I had raised, not the man who betrayed me, but a stranger drowning in the consequences of his own choices. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered my grandson on that porch, barefoot in the snow, forgotten by the man now begging for mercy. Pity turned to steel. "You have 1 week to leave," I said. "After that, the law will remove you." David didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just lowered his head, the weight of his silence heavier than any words he could have spoken. As I turned to leave, I felt no triumph, no joy, only balance. The house was mine again, not through rage, not through vengeance, but through truth. And soon, the last shadow of David's presence would be gone from it. The reckoning was nearly complete. The week passed quietly, though the silence was heavier than any storm. Each day I walked by the house, watching the curtains stay drawn, the lights dim, the driveway slowly empty of cars. David was unraveling behind those walls, not with noise, but with the quiet collapse of a man who had nothing left to hold on to. On the final day, I returned not as a father seeking reconciliation, but as the rightful owner reclaiming what was his. A moving truck sat out front, half loaded. Boxes lined the porch. David stood by the door, shoulders slumped, no fight left in him. His eyes flicked to me once, but there was no arrogance, no defiance. Only a hollow recognition of the man he had erased now standing as the one who erased him. He didn't speak, neither did I. Words had carried us nowhere for years. Silence was sharper, cleaner, more final. One by one, the boxes disappeared into the truck. His wife didn't return. His son wasn't there. He loaded the remnants of his life alone. By dusk, only echoes remained inside. The rooms were bare, stripped of the parties, the lies, the laughter that had once tried to drown me out. When the truck pulled away, David lingered on the porch for a moment, as if waiting for me to say something, anything that might soften the edges of his defeat. But there was nothing left to say. I had spoken my last words the day I told him the house was mine again. He walked past me, down the steps, and into the cold evening. No goodbye, no plea. Just the sound of his footsteps fading into the snow. I stepped into the house, closing the door behind me. The air was different now, emptier, but lighter. For the first time in decades, it felt like mine again. Not because I had taken it back, but because I had never truly lost it. David's lies had only borrowed the walls. My truth had reclaimed them. I stood in the quiet rooms, the silence no longer suffocating but steady, balanced, just. And I knew then, as the night settled in, that the reckoning was complete. The fire of betrayal had burned itself out. All that remained was the truth in me, standing unbroken within it. When the house was finally mine again, silence filled its rooms, not the suffocating kind, but the steady kind that felt like rest after a storm. I walked through each hallway slowly, running my hand along the walls, remembering every nail I had hammered, every corner my wife had decorated, every step my son had once taken when he was still small enough to hold my hand. For years, I had been made to feel like a stranger in this place. Now, I was home. I didn't rush to fill the rooms. There were no parties, no glasses clinking, no false laughter. Just me, the creak of the floorboards, and the sound of wind against the windows. And for the first time, that was enough. Peace doesn't need noise. Truth doesn't need an audience. My grandson came to visit a week later. His little feet echoed in the empty space, and his laugh bounced off the bare walls like music. I watched him run from room to room, touching everything as though discovering a new world. He didn't care that the rooms were empty. To him, the space was alive because it was safe, because it was ours. I sat with him by the fireplace that evening, the flames flickering soft light across his face. He held the wooden toy I had carved for him, the one his mother once called junk. His hands wrapped around it tightly, as though it was treasure. And in that moment I realized it was. Not the toy itself, but the truth of it, love, carved into something simple, lasting, real. David's shadow no longer loomed over us. His absence was heavy, yes, but it was also freeing. The boy didn't ask about him. He didn't look for him. He just leaned against me, warm and safe, and I knew where my duty lay. Not in chasing what was lost, but in guarding what remained. I had my home back. I had my dignity back. And most of all, I had my grandson's trust. That was more than wealth, more than reputation, more than anything David had ever tried to buy. The reckoning was over. What remained was not revenge, it was balance. And in that balance, I found peace. The neighbors whispered at first. Some avoided my eyes when I walked down the street. Others nodded with quiet respect. They all knew what had happened. They knew the house was mine again, that David had fallen, that truth had silenced lies. But I didn't live for their approval anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't explaining myself, excusing my choices, or carrying someone else's weight. I was simply living. The mornings felt different. I'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, steam rising into the cold air, watching snow fall over the porch where I once found my grandson. That sight no longer haunted me, it grounded me. It reminded me that I had chosen to act, that I had broken the cycle of silence. I no longer carried the shame of being erased. Instead, I carried proof that truth could outlast betrayal. David's name still surfaced sometimes in hushed conversations at the market, in the sideways glances of those who once praised him. But his fall wasn't my story to tell anymore. His ruin belonged to him, and I wanted no part of it. My story was here, in the quiet rhythm of days rebuilt, in the laughter of my grandson when he visited, in the steadiness of knowing I had done what needed to be done. At night, I'd light a single candle in the kitchen, not out of sorrow, but out of remembrance for the years I gave, for the sacrifices I made, for the wife I once loved who would have understood this victory without me saying a word. The flame burned steady, just like the peace I felt in my chest. No anger, no bitterness, just balance. I didn't win back time. I didn't reclaim youth, but I had reclaimed my dignity. And in that quiet house, with truth on my side and my grandson's trust in my hands, I finally understood something. Revenge had never been the goal. What I had now was greater. It was freedom. My grandson began to spend more time with me after the dust settled. His small footsteps filled the halls, his laughter weaving through the silence that once felt so heavy. I showed him the attic where his father's old toys still sat in boxes, relics of a childhood David had long abandoned. The boy's eyes lit up as though he'd discovered treasure, and in a way, he had. Those toys weren't just plastic and wood, they were proof of love that had once been real, proof that I had always been there. We built new memories too. Saturday mornings with pancakes, walks to the park where he chased pigeons and asked questions faster than I could answer. Evenings where I read him stories by the fireplace, his head resting against my shoulder until sleep claimed him. The house, once stripped bare by betrayal, grew warm again, not with parties, but with trust. Sometimes he would ask about his father. Not often, but enough. His voice would be quiet, uncertain. "Why doesn't Dad come?" And each time, I would take a deep breath before answering. He made choices, I'd say softly. Choices that hurt people. But you are not him. You are your own. The boy would nod, and I could see the relief in his eyes. He didn't need excuses. He needed truth. The same truth that had carried me through fire. I no longer feared those questions. I no longer feared silence. The truth was enough. It had always been enough. In the evenings, after he was asleep, I would sit alone and think of the years I had lost, the decades of sacrifice, the nights of hunger, the humiliation of being erased. But the bitterness was gone. In its place was something sturdier, quieter, peace. I had faced the fire of betrayal, walked through the ashes, and come out whole. What I had now wasn't wealth or recognition. It was something rarer. The steady presence of love, unbought, unbroken, the kind of inheritance no lie could erase. And as I tucked the boy's blanket tighter around him, I knew the future was no longer David's to shape. It was mine to protect. The seasons turned, and the house settled into a rhythm of quiet strength. Spring sunlight touched the windows that had once been shuttered against me. Summer breezes carried laughter through the open doors as my grandson chased fireflies in the yard. Autumn leaves drifted across the porch where betrayal had once frozen my heart. And in winter, when the snow returned, I no longer saw abandonment, I saw survival, proof that we had endured. Neighbors began to stop by again, not with pity but with genuine warmth. They'd bring pies, lend tools, share conversation on the porch. I accepted it without shame. For years, I had lived with my head bowed, convinced that silence was the price of loyalty. Now, I met their eyes without flinching. They didn't see a man broken by his son's betrayal, they saw a man who had reclaimed what was his. I kept the house simple. No lavish parties, no extravagant displays. Just clean walls, steady repairs, and the sound of life returning one breath at a time. The garden my wife once loved bloomed again under my care. My grandson planted seeds with small, eager hands, his laughter ringing out as we worked side by side. Each flower that rose from the soil felt like proof that healing was possible, that truth could take root and flourish where lies had once spread. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand in the doorway of the boy's room, watching him sleep. His chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful, and I knew he was safe. Safe from the cold, safe from neglect, safe from the hunger for wealth that had devoured his father. Safe because I had chosen to act when silence was no longer enough. I didn't think of David often. When I did, it was not with anger, but with distance, as though he were a figure from another life. His choices were his burden now, and I no longer carried them. My hands, once emptied by sacrifice, were full again, not with wealth, but with purpose. What I had now was not just a house, it was a home, a fortress built not of lies, but of truth. And in its quiet rooms, I finally found what I had been searching for all along, peace that no one could take from me again. Life grew quieter, but never empty. My days found shape in small rituals, brewing coffee at dawn, tending the garden by noon, reading stories to my grandson at night. These were not grand victories, not the kind that made headlines, but they were victories all the same. the kind a man earns when he refuses to surrender to silence. I began to repair the house piece by piece. Fresh paint on the walls, new shingles on the roof, steady hands restoring what neglect had let rot. Each nail I hammered, each board I replaced felt like an act of reclaiming not just the house, but myself. It was no longer a monument to betrayal. It was a sanctuary built on truth. There were days when the memories tried to claw back. The sound of David's laughter during his parties, the sight of my grandson shivering on the porch, the humiliation of standing outside my own home. Those moments returned like ghosts, but they no longer ruled me. They reminded me instead of why I had acted, why I had chosen justice over silence. The boy thrived. His laughter grew louder, his steps surer. He no longer looked over his shoulder, no longer waited for a father who would not come. He looked to me instead with trust, with warmth, with the kind of love that doesn't fade when money dries up. And each time he reached for my hand, I felt stronger than I ever had in my youth. Neighbors sometimes asked if I regretted it taking the house back, ending David's illusion. My answer was always the same. Number. Regret belongs to those who act out of vengeance. What I did was not vengeance. It was balance, and balance has no regret. I sat by the fire one evening, my grandson asleep upstairs, and realized something profound. Betrayal does not define a man. What defines him is what he chooses to do with it. I chose to act. I chose to stand. I chose to protect the only thing that still mattered, love that asked for nothing but honesty. What I had now was more than peace. It was redemption not for David, but for me. As the years stretched on, the weight of betrayal faded like smoke after a fire. What remained was not bitterness, but clarity. I had carried pain for so long that I almost forgot what life felt like without it. Now, each sunrise felt like a gift. Each laugh from my grandson like a promise that the cycle had been broken. The house no longer echoed with absence. It was alive again. Photographs lined the walls, not of grand parties or false smiles, but of quiet moments. My grandson, with dirt on his hands from the garden, me holding a fishing rod beside him, the two of us smiling without pretense. Those pictures weren't decorations. They were proof. Proof that truth had outlasted lies, that love had survived betrayal. Sometimes I would sit on the porch at dusk, the same porch where my grandson had once been left to freeze. Now he sat beside me, his feet swinging, his voice full of questions about the stars, about life, about everything his young mind could reach for. I answered what I could, and when I couldn't, I just listened. Because that was what he needed most, someone who would never turn him away, never shut the door. I thought of David less and less. He had become a shadow at the edge of memory, blurred and distant. His choices had carved him out of our lives, and I no longer felt the need to drag him back. My energy belonged to the boy who trusted me, to the life that still had meaning. The neighbors stopped whispering. They started smiling instead, greeting me not with pity, but with warmth. They saw a man who had endured fire and walked out steady, not charred. They saw that revenge had never been my aim, that what I had gained was something deeper, something unshakable. And in those moments, sitting with my grandson, watching the stars prick the dark sky, I knew the truth. I had not only reclaimed my house, I had reclaimed myself. What I had now was simple. It was love, it was peace, it was freedom. And nothing, not betrayal, not silence, not even time could take that from me again. Winter returned once more, the air sharp and still, the snow laying its quiet blanket over the street. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching my grandson build a crooked little snowman in the yard. His laughter rose into the cold air, warm enough to melt every shadow that betrayal had ever left behind. I thought of the first Christmas I had found him shivering on the porch, forgotten by the very people meant to protect him. And now, here he was safe, joyful, alive in a home where truth, not lies, held the walls together. That memory no longer broke me. It reminded me of how far we had come, of what had been taken, and of what I had reclaimed. David was nowhere in sight. His absence no longer stung. It no longer mattered. The man who had once towered over me with arrogance had been reduced to silence, and I had no interest in breaking it. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness. Forgiveness belongs to those who still seek a place in your life. David had forfeited his. As the snowman took shape, my grandson looked up at me through the window and waved, his cheeks red from the cold. I raised my hand in return, and in that simple gesture, I felt everything I had fought for settle into place. I wasn't just a man who had taken back a house. I was a grandfather who had protected what mattered most. I was a father who had faced betrayal without letting it define me. I was a man who had walked through fire and chosen not to burn. The reckoning was finished. The silence that had once been my prison was now my peace. No more waiting, no more begging, no more pretending. I had my home. I had my grandson's trust. I had myself. And as I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air filling my lungs, I whispered the words I had carried all along. This isn't revenge. This is the bill you never paid.